So a little bit of background to me. I trained as a GP, went through a PhD in health services research, and for the last 25 years I've done what I call implementation research. I consider myself a trialist. I've done something like 50 cluster randomized trials of different implementation strategies across a broad range of settings. I work in environments where clinical trials get done, and I think clinical trials are a thing of beauty. They are things that sort of basically, when they're done well, I'm sure they are done well here, they are things that sort of just make me feel good about the world. However, one of the things I'm going to say today is that trials are wonderful things of beauty. They're necessary but not sufficient. And I think we need to think about what we can do that will actually also increase the likelihood they influence practice. So this is just to remind me that I'm a long way from home. This is, I live in Ottawa, and it's the federal capital of Canada. Much more interesting than Canberra, I have to confess. And we, on the 1st of July, celebrate Canada Day, which is a big party, and we have a big party on the hill with flyovers. I've come down to Australia quite often, but I normally choose to come here around about March, when in Canada it's -15 in white, and you also have some cars going around somewhere very close to here. So it's a bit of a shock to come down here now, when it's +25 before the humidex in Ottawa, and it's -3 in Sandringham this morning. So, when I was thinking about this, one of the things that I've been reflecting on recently is that I think the role of research, and particularly applied research, is to reduce uncertainties of the relevant stakeholders to allow them to make better informed, evidence-informed decisions. And ideally, research that demonstrates clear benefits, acceptable harms that are affordable and feasible in a healthcare setting should result in rapid, wide-scale implementation of innovation. That's kind of, we're very interested in the knowledge we generate, but for a lot of us, it's actually about, we're interested in trying to improve the health of our patients or the populations that we serve. This is rather tongue-in-cheek, and I apologize, because I know that you're all more sophisticated than this. But I think some of the issues is that implementation is easy. We do my gold standard trial, which basically I obsess over for 5 years. I managed to get it in the New England Journal of Medicine, and then, hey, the world will change. Okay? And there's still a kind of naive view that somehow if we just do good science and we publish it in high-impact journals, the world will change. And that's clearly not the case. What we know from repeated studies is, in healthcare systems, we're not managing to implement what we knew 5, 10, 15 years ago, never mind kind of new evidence coming out in a very robust way. And Andrew will actually tell us the truth, but as I was preparing this, I was thinking this is a very simplified view about what implementation might look like. But what I would argue is that we have individual trials rather than an individual trial. That then needs to be synthesized within a systematic review. And then depending on the change, you might need policy implementation. You might need a change in coverage. You might need a change in sort of, say, the organization of healthcare systems, reimbursement structures. So you might need a policy change. You'll often need a service development if it's something that's not just, say, a sort of simple drug intervention. How are we actually going to embed this in the practice of our hospital or primary care practice? And then you need change at the level of the patient and the clinician. And what this highlights to me is that there are many different stakeholders that, if we want to get implementation, are going to need to be aware of the research evidence. We need to think about their informational needs. So in terms of reducing uncertainties, I think some of the things we might want to consider is, what is the decision you're trying to inform, and who are the decision makers? Now, for some things, it may be the clinician is absolutely the primary decision maker about what we need to do. If you've got, say, if you do comparative effectiveness research and you've got 2 treatments which are all on the formulary, easily accessible, don't require any changes in process of care, it may be the clinician or the clinician and the patient dyad that is what you need to influence. But quite often we're going to have to go out and also think about how we influence people like, I don't know if we influence Andrew, but the people Andrew influences in terms of coverage decisions at a federal or state level. We might have to think about what the managers are, what our managers have to think about this in our world. So being quite clear about what is the decision you're trying to inform. You may think this is a trial which is just about surgical versus drug treatment for condition X, but actually for other decision makers that raises a whole range of other issues, and if we don't address their needs, then that will be a barrier to implementation because they also have to change what they do. So here is a very scanty view about what are some of the uncertainties that decision makers need to be addressed. So clinical audiences are very interested in benefits, the clinical benefits in particular. I've got harms there, but I've actually sort of faded out. My sense is that as clinicians, yeah, we kind of are interested in harms, but we probably put less emphasis on that than if I'm a patient and I'm thinking about, okay, well, Rochelle is shaking her head, and that's absolutely fine. But what I'm going to sort of say is that I think if I'm a patient trying to make a decision, harms are really central to my decision making. And I do think, I mean, my experience certainly in Canada, you're clearly a much more educated audience here, is that clinicians do, I think clinicians and patients will not put the same weight on benefits and harms. I'm interested as a clinician in the heterogeneity of response. Which patients or which settings will get more, are likely to get more benefit from this or more harm? Because that might help me think about telling what my interventions are. If I'm a patient, I want to know about the benefits, but I also probably want to know about things like impact on quality of life. Now, again, clinicians will say we're interested in that, but as a patient, it's much more personal. I'm interested in the harms. I'm interested in the acceptability. If this requires me now to go to the hospital once a week to get some additional test, that actually is a huge additional burden for me to do. And it may mean it's less acceptable for whatever reasons. Want to think about how preference might influence that, and then just basically how the innovation impacts on me. If you've got something that makes my life easier and keeps me healthier, that's great. But if you've got something that gives me marginal benefit and makes my life much harder, yeah, I may decide that this is something that I'm not that excited about. This is the reality of the kind of burden of disease that people, particularly with chronic disease, are facing. For managers, they'll probably be interested in the benefits, clinical and quality of life, harms, feasibility, but also implementability and scalability and the implications for other services. So if we're going to introduce this new treatment for heart failure, well, that requires us to have advanced imaging for patients with heart, with potential heart problems. What does that mean for service provision in the hospital about how we actually, do we have the capacity, do we have the slots, do our radiologists have the training for that? These are things that managers will be saying, okay, well, it's very easy to say, well, there's a little change here, but there's all these knock-on effects, and I need to know about these knock-on effects because we're not going to be able to implement this if I don't know what those are. At a policymaker level, all of the above, including, but also cost effectiveness and affordability in a publicly funded system. Does this look like it's going to provide good investment of resources? I might be interested in equity issues. I'll be interested in things like scalability. Can we roll this across the state? Yeah, we can do this in the Alfred, but it's actually there's something that we can actually roll across statewide, so all of the citizens in our state will benefit from this. And then research funders are going to sort of say, well, what are the remaining uncertainties? Is this now solved? Can we move on? Or is it leading to a whole range of new questions that we have to address? And can we be more sophisticated and nuanced in those questions? So recognizing there are multiple stakeholders and they have different bits of the picture they want to look at. And if we only, say, address the clinician uncertainties, then I would argue that for many, many innovations, we're not going to basically get implementation quickly because all of these other things still need to be worked through. We can think about what are outcomes of interest to different decision makers, and also what changes an outcome, minimally important differences, would be convincing to different decision makers. At a population level, if we have a cheap intervention that is minimally effective, that may still be worthwhile doing it. If we can deliver this intervention at scale for $1 a citizen and you get a 1% improvement in outcome, that may be efficient at the population level. As a clinician, I'd never have an MCID, a minimally important clinical difference of 1%. But we should also be thinking about these things in terms of what will persuade different audiences. So I think a key issue for trialists is how we maximize the informativeness of our trials to address the uncertainties of different stakeholders. And we need to actually sort of think about who the stakeholders are and what the uncertainties are when we're planning trials, and use that as part of our decision making about what we're going to look at. I want to give just a couple of case studies. Andrew Wilson is the only person in this room that's old enough to remember this trial, apart from me. But this is the ISIS-2 trial. Probably, certainly for me, this was the landmark first major trial, large simple trial that that basically everyone said was, what we needed to do. So it randomized 18,000 patients, 417 centers, 2-by-2 factorial design. The outcome was vascular mortality at 5 weeks and 15 months. And they did do some look at harms, and they showed a reduction in mortality. And this did lead to practice change. This is now standard of care. But what I would argue is that the ISIS-2 trial was completely silent on implementation. And then around the world, we had to do lots of research to say, well, what on earth does this mean? How do we actually organize our ambulance services, our intensive or critical care, or emergency services to actually handle this? How do we actually reduce needle to door or door to needle time, whatever else? So although ISIS-2 was wonderful, it actually only answered, I think, the clinical question, the clinical uncertainty. Didn't answer any of the implementation issues. And it did mean that it actually took a lot of additional work. It made a very compelling argument we should do this, but it required a lot of additional work then to actually lead to implementation. So large, simple trials, in my mind, they're commonly drug trials. They're normally patient randomized. The sample size is large, for thousands. Commonly but not exclusively two-arm trials. There's a limited number of clinical endpoints. They're often industry and public funded. And I think traditionally they address the clinical uncertainty, but they basically largely don't address the kind of the broader health service implementation issues. They don't have quality of life. They may not follow patients over a prolonged period of time. They may only do a limited economic evaluation. So it's not that I'm saying that we shouldn't do these, but we should recognize that they may not address all the informational needs. And it may be as a trialist, I could actually add sub-projects in that would allow in some settings that we can do further follow-up, or we can look at the service delivery side. I'm going to give you a counter example, which was done in, I worked in the Health Services Research Unit in Aberdeen for many years, and it's a trial that was done there. And I'm not putting this up saying this is a fabulous trial that's a gold standard. It's just a different example. So this was a trial that was looking at conservative alternatives to hysterectomy. It's when the new surgical techniques were coming out that said instead of having hysterectomy, you could either have endometrial ablation or endometrial resection. It was a small trial, relatively. It was 204 women who were randomized hysterectomy versus these two other approaches in a 2-to-1-to-1. The outcomes were operative complications, post-operative recovery, relief of menstrual symptoms, patient satisfaction, and there's also things like psychological distress, long-term clinical outcomes, and economic evaluation. What they demonstrated is that in the first 12 months, a hysteroscopic surgery led to fewer post-op complications, shorter post-op recovery, similar relief of non-bleeding menstrual symptoms, slightly less patient satisfaction, but cost savings for the patient and the NHS for over 12 months. And in the first 12 months, we noticed that a small number of women treated with hysteroscopic surgery still required a hysterectomy. So for some women, it wasn't sufficient. They had to move on to that. Now, if you look at this, it actually gives a kind of a much broader range of information, that if you were a woman faced with this choice, if you were a manager thinking about what does this mean for our service, or if you're a decision maker who was trying to think about should we cover this, there's a lot more information gained out of this. One of the other things is they were actually able to follow these women up over multiple time periods. And what they found by 5 years was that I think it's about a quarter of women who went through the hysteroscopic surgery ended up requiring a hysterectomy. And if you looked at the economics, it meant it was completely balanced. There was not a dominant view of this. And that, because they're able to follow this up in this sort of richer way, I think clarified that this is actually something that should be a preference-based decision for the women. Both of these treatments are effective. If you're a woman who's slightly older and likely to go into through menopause within the next 5 years, you might think, I'll do the conservative alternatives. I'm going to get out of hospital quicker. I'm going to have less complications. I'm probably not going to need further surgery. If you're a younger woman, in her 30s, you might think, I may actually think about a hysterectomy more seriously because the likelihood that I'm going to have to require additional surgery beyond this. I'm not a woman, and I've not had to face this decision. But it actually, the ability to collect this rich data, I think, provided a much more nuanced answer to a yes-no. And it kind of provided the information that, again, women and service providers needed to actually think about, well, what does this mean for us? I'm also not a clinical content expert in this area, as you probably guessed. This was one of the things when I was talking about pragmatic trials. I think the initial responses to pragmatic trials were the large, simple trials, but also these sort of these medium-sized fat trials, which are do drugs, but also look at device and technology, service delivery arrangements. You'll often have patient and cluster randomized trials. The sample size are moderate. Diverse designs, but a broader range of outcomes, publicly funding, and I think they get closer to addressing the clinical and health services uncertainty. Okay? So all I'm trying to sort of say is we design our trials, we can design them to address different types of uncertainty, and we should be thinking about that when we're designing our trial about, what are we trying to do within this trial? And if you want to think about implementation or increasing the likelihood of implementation, what we would like is that I think we're not just addressing a single stakeholder's uncertainty. So what can we do to do this? This is not rocket science, and I'm sure you're doing a lot of this. Some of the issues will be actually to speak to those decision makers when you're planning your trial, to understand their uncertainties and their informational needs. Use available research infrastructure. We now have at sort of national, international level things like the James Lind Alliance, which is helping set priorities. We can use systematic reviews to clarify what the remaining uncertainties are. And we can use things like core outcome sets. And one of the issues around that is that when we come to, for our trials to be incorporated into systematic reviews, if we've used a core outcome set, it makes the reviewer's life much better. So even though we might have our own pet outcome measure, wherever possible, we should be thinking about a cumulative body of knowledge that we're contributing to and using kind of, as much as possible, the kind of standard approaches. In terms of and then when we think about the design and conduct, we can think about design philosophy. Are we moving towards a more pragmatic versus explanatory? If we are in the explanatory mode, we should accept that actually, what we're trying to do is answer the question about can the intervention work, and it's probably not ready for thinking about prime time implementation. But if we're thinking in that pragmatic mode, then we are sort of saying we're at the level of knowledge development where we actually need to know how we position this within the clinical world. We can think about design elements. Certainly in my area, the default is a two-arm trial, which actually is probably wasted opportunity. You can probably, by using different designs, factorial designs, multi-arm trials, get more information out of the trials in a useful way. We need to think about how we generate that additional information. So we might want to think about fidelity checks, qualitative experience of process evaluations, theory-based evaluations, and economic evaluation. There are ways, I increasingly see the randomized trial as being the kernel, and then we build a range of other inquiries around that will help try and address these uncertainties of the different stakeholders. So, how are you doing, Chris? Coming back to this, so far I've largely talked about here, but what I want to sort of say is, when we've done a trial, there are babies, we love them, and we think the world should love them. But actually, our trials should only feed into systematic reviews. Brian Eno, who was a musician, producer, working with Peter Schmidt, created a number of oblique strategies. The idea is that if you're working in your studio and you have an artistic block, you pull one out and it's supposed to sort of try and shake up your thinking. But across my Twitter feed recently, this came across. So oblique strategy, you're not building a wall, but you're making a brick. And I think with due respect to people in my world and possibly your world, we often believe our trial is the wall when actually it's a brick. And we should just accept it's a brick and think about how we can make the most beautiful, informative brick there is and how we can give the brick to the builder who's going to make the wall. So I would like to argue that we should be much more modest as trialists. Individual studies rarely by themselves are sufficient to justify changes in policy and practice. Hence, evidence-informed decision-making should consider systematic reviews of the global evidence base. If you look at models of evidence-based informed policy and practice, they emphasize the importance of practitioners and policymakers identifying relevant systematic reviews, not individual trials, to inform decisions. So, yeah, I think as trialists, we have to sort of say our main role is that we are an input into a systematic review. I think that's probably quite hard because, you know, we love our trials and we think they're babies and, you know, they're going to go on and change the world. Systematic reviews are more useful to inform policy and practice because together the included studies represent a broader set of participants, context, operationalization of interventions, comparative conditions and outcomes. A systematic review will always be more pragmatic than an individual trial because you just have a broader range of operation within that. They avoid the problems of mono-operationalization bias and potentially mono-measurement bias inherent in single studies. So, question for you. Would you rather have one trial of 20,000 patients or 4 trials of 5,000 patients? How many people would like one trial of 20,000 patients? How many people would like 4 trials of 5,000 patients? Okay. So it's just showing that you're recognizing actually, you know, if you put all your eggs into one 20,000 basket, it could be wrong. You know, there could be a screw up in the trial. And also it's likely to be in a finite number of settings, whereas if you've got 4 or 5 trials across country, one of the things about ICES2 is it was GISI 2 or 3 in Italy was around the same time, and those 2 pieces of evidence together were actually quite compelling. And systematic reviews allow us to start to look at the generalizability of findings and source of heterogeneity. So, yeah, that I think then has implications for trialists. One of the implications is we have to really commit to full, open, transparent reporting of our trials. We need to register them. Everyone in this room will register their trials. There are still trials out there being done that are not registered. We need to publish full study protocols. You know, there are lots of ways places you can make your study protocol available. We need to have full and transparent reporting of the study. And by that, we actually need to provide information in terms of things like the context in which it was done, detailed description of the interventions. Tammy's going to talk later about just the kind of difficulty once you move into more complex interventions about understanding what's there and all the outcomes. We need to make the full data set and study materials available. I have not yet made one of my data sets available. I'm a bit scared about thinking about what that's going to require, but that's what we need to do. You know, we just need to grasp the nettle and say, this is the way that we will advance science and do good for the world. And we need to respond to systematic review authors' requests for further information. Okay? So we are a source of knowledge, but you know, we then need to sort of basically plug our knowledge in. The final thing is this was our simplified implementation pathway. One of the issues is that we actually don't know how to do things beyond the systematic review particularly well. We don't know how to change policy. We don't know how to change practice. Although I think Sophia said I'm an expert in this, as all experts, I know now much less than I knew 20 years ago. So we also need implementation trials where we actually are testing out and comparing different ways of delivering implementation strategies and implementation systematic reviews. And again, I think within many of the kind of trial networks that you actually cover, you have the ability to do both the clinical knowledge generation, but also opportunities to think about how can we roll this forward and implement those, and actually also contribute to the implementation science literature. So just in summary, trials aim to reduce uncertainty of relevant stakeholders to allow them to make better informed decisions. Implementation research